was close. Okay, so this is Paul Crone for the LDAR 455 class, Current Issues and Topics. And today we'll be interviewing or listening to an interview with Jacqui Patterson. And this took place at a conference sometime over the last, let's see, it looks like March 2018. It's environment as a human rights issue is the topic of her presentation and her interview.
Thank you all for coming to Phoenix Sustainability Initiative's main speaker event, the environment as a human rights issue. I'm Sri Marotra, third year in the college, studying environmental science and minoring in human rights. As I'm sure you can tell from my coursework, I'm passionate about this topic and excited to share it with all of you. I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker, Jacqui Patterson. Ms. Patterson is the director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program. She first became involved in environmental justice work as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer in Jamaica, where Shell oil contaminated the local water supplies. Later, she noticed that the U.S. lacked a gendered analysis of climate change and decided to empower women who are impacted by climate change through her Women of Color Climate Justice Road Tour. She also co-founded Women of Color United and has served as Senior Women's Rights Policy Analyst for ActionAid, where she integrated food rights, macroeconomics, and climate change through a women's rights perspective. She has held a variety of roles: researcher, program manager, and activist, while advocating for gender, racial, economic, and environmental justice. Patterson holds master's degrees in social work from the University of Maryland and in public health from Johns Hopkins University. Ms. Patterson will be joined by Mark Templeton, clinical professor at the University of Chicago Law School, who will be moderating the conversation. As the director of the Abrams Environmental Law Clinic, Professor Templeton and his co-instructor oversee the work of approximately 20 law students each quarter and bring lawsuits against polluters and governments who violate environmental laws, as well as advocating for reforms to environmental laws and regulations. Professor Templeton has served as a trustee and executive director of the Office of Independent Trustees for the $20 billion Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill Trust. Prior to that, he was Senior Advisor to the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and Advisor to the U.S. Delegation to the UN Commission on Human Rights. He has earned an AB in Social Studies from Harvard College and a JD from Yale Law School. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Jacqui Patterson and Professor Mark Templeton.
Okay, can you hear us all right? Great. First of all, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Sri and PSI. Here, a round of applause. I have been wanting to have Jacqui come to campus for probably 3 or 4 years now, since we at the Abrams Clinic over at the law school started doing work with her and some of her colleagues in Indiana and Michigan. And so I'm really grateful that Sri and PSI and student government helped make this event possible. And the Jacqui's busy schedule permitted it. So thank you, Jacqui, for coming. So I am going to start off by asking some questions of Jacqui, which is probably going for a long time, but I will stop and make sure to open the floor up to you all and really look forward to your questions as well. So Jacqui, I just want to start off, for those who are not as familiar with environmental justice as a concept or the field, could you start off just by kind of explaining what that means generally and what it means in your work?
Yeah, sure. So generally, environmental justice is defined as the uneven distribution of the burdens and the benefits of the environment. So when they talk about environmental justice communities, they're referring to communities that are disproportionately negatively impacted by pollution and other environmental-based injustices. And then also it refers to the the uneven enjoyment of the bounty in terms of the environment, and how some groups are more benefited by the wild lands and so forth and the wild places than others.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the examples of the things that you're working on these days to address some of these issues?
Yeah.
I was just thinking in terms of helping to make it concrete for people.
Sure. So one is working with communities that are facing these environmental injustices. So working with communities like Dixon, Tennessee, where the community had faced having their water supply contaminated because of the erosion of a landfill liner, and that resulted in trichloroethylene getting into their water supply, and then the community not knowing that this was happening, and then drinking that water for years, and then finding out later that the community, this is the African American community that was drinking the water for years, while white American families in the area had gotten letters saying not to drink the water. And so they only started to find out when they saw a rare, odd pattern of rare forms of birth defects and then premature cancers. And then that's when they investigated and found out that years ago people had gotten these letters not to drink the water. And so those kind of situations that we're dealing with communities across the country, helping them to find justice in those circumstances and helping them have relief from those kind of toxic exposures.
And in your work, I'm kind of stunned, frankly, that it wasn't that they weren't even officials weren't even aware. It was literally different notification, which led different communities based on color to take different actions with different impacts on their health.
Even the animal shelter had been put on an alternate form of water during that time. So it was egregious, and they did win a settlement because it was very clear. It was in the county records that these letters had gone out, and it was in the county records that they didn't go out to other folks. And so they $3 million settlement, but that was nothing compared to the loss of life and so forth that happened.
How often in your work are you seeing these kinds of things which are so egregious on their face, like this, versus what some people might say is kind of a subtler, where they don't even bother looking, or there are not enough resources for this community for whatever set of reasons, and so there are discriminatory impacts from that. I mean, how does it kind of, I don't know, how does it break out between those kinds of things? Are you seeing a lot of the really egregious facial kind of problems?
No, I do see a shocking amount of the most egregious, where, places where there's these intense cancer clusters where it's just undeniable that, other folks don't have these rates of cancer. One community, I recently did a panel at the UN Commission on the Status of Women, and one person on the panel was from Port Gibson, Mississippi, where there's a nuclear reactor there, and she talked about how since the nuclear reactor came online, all of the cancers that had developed in the community, premature cancers, and she spoke specifically about having 3 sisters, and she and all 3 of her sisters had each lost a classmate before high school graduation to cancer in that community. And so unfortunately those stories are all too common. Those cancer clusters are all too common. But then there are other communities where folks don't even know that it's not the norm that half the kids in the classroom have asthma, and half the people in their church have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Like, they don't even realize that that's not what happens in the world. Not like in all other communities. It's just just happening to them, and so it isn't as obvious to them, and then they're invisible to others. And it's because of the lack of monitoring and enforcement that happens around these exposures. A lot of folks are kind of suffering and dying in silence and invisibility.
You were talking about these cancer clusters, right, which are places where there's much higher incidence of cancer, certain kinds of cancers, and while they're called cancer clusters, there are also other places where the people have a lot of issues such as birth defects, I'm sorry, go ahead. Respiratory illness, etc. How do you think about that issue in the sense that in terms of strategies? I think that often maybe not always, but often these are places that have multiple industrial facilities, or it's the nuclear power plant by the chemical power plant, by the petroleum refinery, by the cement. I mean, whatever the whole. It's a whole. So how do you think about, like, in the local communities you work with, kind of think about the strategy for something, because it may not be just the permit for a particular facility, and is that facility emitting too much? Although it might be that,
Right.
but it's a whole complex. So how do you all think about that?
Yeah, so it's a challenge, and then unfortunately, again, there's too many communities in that circumstance. You have a place like Mossville, Louisiana, where it's that very thing, where there's these cumulative, all these, it's in the petrochemical corridor, and they just have this conflagration of all these different places, pollutant sources. And so the conversation there is, is this really just, like, do we fight this on principle, the fact that, that these facilities shouldn't be polluting these communities, or should we just really focus on getting folks out of harm's way? And that really becomes the conversation, because it's not right that the people would be the ones that have to move and have their whole lives torn asunder, but yet at the same time, the reality is that it's not necessarily politically or economically viable to see those facilities move instead. So this becomes the struggle in so many places. And so you have like East Chicago, Indiana, where I don't know if folks know about the situation there with the contamination of the soil and water and so forth from this lead. And it was so intense that, 1,000 times the EPA allowable amount of arsenic and lead in the soil, and 30 times the allowable amount of lead in the kids' blood there. And so they finally kind of condemned the area and said that the years and years of remediation weren't going to be enough, and there hasn't been enough, and so it was not going to be enough. And so not only have they moved folks, it's not like they've moved the entire community. They've moved, some people have gone to Allgall Gardens here in Chicago, other people have gone to other places in Indiana. So literally the generations that have lived together in community for years, the whole community no longer exists. The people together no longer exist. Some families have even been split up from not being able. So you have a lot of places that are in the circumstances of having to make those types of choices.
If people in that kind of community came to you and said, what should we be thinking about here, right? Because the community is providing us with bonds and the multi-generational aspects and things like that, but you also have this incredible contamination. How would you help them think through those issues?
Yeah, so one thing, just even looking now, because we were also working on climate change, and you have in this place called Ile-de-Jean-Charles in Louisiana, this community called the Ile-de-Jean-Charles, Biloxi, Chittamauga, Choctaw Nation that had to move because of sea level rise. And in that case, there was actually intentional efforts made to keep that group together and move them together. And so we actually called on some of the legal folks that we know, the law schools that we knew to get a sense of, like, what are the legal handles? Like, are there any legal handles to help people to be able to have the right to stay together and to be able to, and were they doing that based on treaty rights, or what exactly were the legal handles there? So we're still trying to find out, because we weren't able to keep people together with East Chicago as much as people wanted it. So that's all to say, it's an open question that we're trying to find the answer to, because we not only we have other communities that are having to move because of the toxins, but we also have other communities that are facing having to move because of sea level rise as well.
How do you think about your role in the national NAACP in the context of these local communities? So I guess that's kind of a more general question. What is the relationship of the national organization to the local communities generally, and particularly in your field? And then in a context like this, how do you help the communities, but maybe not impose your will coming from the national perspective? Or is there possible divergence of agenda
Yeah.
in certain cases here?
So it depends. So the relationship, first off, the NAACP is the sum of its parts. We have 2,200 branches and chapters throughout the country, and they are the NAACP. And technically, if things are the way they're supposed to be, we're supposed to be in service to the agenda and the desires of our frontline communities, which is our branches and chapters. And so that's the idea. And generally, we try to maintain that. The times when it kind of diverges is, and we maintain it in a number of different ways. We facilitate visioning sessions with communities, and then out of those visioning sessions, we help them to develop a strategy to get to wherever they want to go as it relates to whatever comes out of the vision. Then we connect them to partners who can help them go to where they want to go. Sometimes, one of the times I was meeting with a community in West Virginia, it wasn't part of the visioning session, but in the course of the branch meeting, they started talking about going down to this job fair and holding a job fair for oil and gas, to get jobs in the oil and gas industry.
So how does that make you feel?
Yeah, so then that becomes a place where you're thinking, okay, what principle overrides the other principle? Because you have a principle of bottom up organized, and then you have a principle of like leave it in the ground and so forth. And so that's where you start to see some of those conflicts. Fortunately, in that case, I wasn't called upon to help host the oil and gas job fair, so I didn't have to make any tough choices, but
So that's where you would have drawn the line.
That's where I would have to draw the line. Yeah.
Interesting.
Uh-huh.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you talked about visioning. What other forms of support and resources does the national organization provide to the local branches?
Yeah, it's really that combination of the visioning, the facilitation of the strategy sessions. So like people will come up with their vision, like we want clean air, we want clean water, and so forth. And then we'll we'll facilitate things like developing a SWOT analysis and so forth. And
what is a SWOT analysis for people who don't know?
Yeah, sorry. Which is like deciding what the strengths, the weaknesses, opportunities, and the threats are to whatever it is the vision is. And then from there, figuring out what are their assets in their community, and and so forth. And then from there, developing a plan to get to where they want to go, and then figuring out how do we eliminate the threats and the barriers, and then how do we build on the strengths and the assets and opportunities. And then from there, we will provide technical support in them doing that, whatever it is, or we will connect them with partners, whether it's universities or other nonprofit organizations who might have more expertise in one area or another to help them, or we'll connect them with financial resources if that's what they need in order to do what they want to do. But we'll also introduce them to models, like, okay, here was another community that wanted to do something similar, and here's a blueprint of how they did it, and they were successful, and here's how you could customize that to your situation.
So you have a long history of working on environmental type issues. How long is the history of the NAACP working on environmental issues, and how much of a priority is it for the organization today, in light of all of the other issues for communities of color and maybe even under the current administration? So where does environment, I guess, both historically and presently kind of fit within the priorities for the NAACP?
Yeah, so it's historically the communities who have been on the front lines, whether it's folks in some of the historic kind of foundational cases that formed the EJ movement, like the Warren County, North Carolina case around the PCBs, which stands for, I forget what it stands for even. But anyway, it's a toxic. So the work that they did there in the front lines to fight against landfill violations and that kind of thing. And so NAACP was right there as part of that, because NAACP is in so many places, particularly in the Southeast. And so there's the communities who have been fighting these fights at the front lines for decades now. But then there is the national program, which just started 8 years ago. And so the national program didn't even come as a result of like a groundswell of these communities rising up and saying we have these environmental injustices. It really came as a result of this realization around the intersection of climate change and African American communities in particular, but civil rights in general. And so, and even that didn't come through a groundswell. It was really one of the big green organizations who came and met with us, and another organization that had been funded to put together this commission to engage African Americans on climate change. And so there was this notion that the NAACP can really start to engage African Americans on climate change. And so it didn't start in that organic way, really, as a program. But in the first few years, since because I came in as a founding director, I started to have conversations with communities. And even though they didn't necessarily see climate justice or climate change to be directly intersectional with their lives, as we started to have these conversations, they started to see those connections. And it's grown as a program. We've particularly drawn the intersections between traditional environmental justice and climate change, and so in weaving together those connections, people have gotten more interested. And over the years, it's gone from being the smallest program out of the 6 program areas, which include health, criminal justice, economic justice, and so forth, to the largest department in the association. And so it's definitely grown in that sense.
You're quite a director then.
The needs are out there, I think.
Well, can you say more about the needs? Because in the sense that we started the conversation about environmental justice, and it largely started off with conversations about Warren County and toxics and landfills and people living adjacent to and birth defects. I mean, kind of your traditional litany, when we think about the traditional litany of environmental harms, how does climate factor into that? Where are the harms, and how does it harm African American communities?
So climate factors in both in terms of some of the traditional EJ is part of the climate continuum, because those same toxic facilities that are harming communities and their environmental health are the same ones that are spewing out the greenhouse gas emissions that drive climate change. So we see that. So
coal-fired power plants, chemical plants, okay.
Yeah, and even landfills and incinerators because of the methane that they put out. So all of these different practices that are harmful from a traditional EJ standpoint, many of them are contributing to climate change. So that's one key intersection that we see. And on the climate change side, we see how communities of color, whether it's Katrina or otherwise, are disproportionately impacted by climate change on the other side of the climate continuum. And so, and yet are least responsible for the greenhouse emissions that drive climate change, because it tends to be wealthier communities that consume more, and the consumption is what's driving this climate change.
Do you find interest? So I can see the Katrina, the kind of, I'll say, coastal related climate change issues. Is climate change an issue of salience to branches and chapters kind of in the Midwest and other parts of the country that may not be having the brunt of things like Katrina or Harvey or et cetera?
It depends. So to some extent, this is the importance of the first couple of years, which was helping to weave the narrative, like helping people to see the arc of climate change and see that entire continuum and where they fall on that continuum. So certainly in the Midwest, that's disproportionately host to these coal-fired power plants in particularly urban areas. They see that connection. When we also talk about the shifts in agricultural yields and drought and the effects on farmers, certainly with some of the rural areas, even in the Midwest and the plain states and so forth, people start to see the connection because they've seen how the agricultural yields have shifted. Communities of color are disproportionately sustenance fisher folks, and they've seen how their waterways across the country have changed. And so folks have definitely seen. And then also in the urban heat islands that we have in the Midwest and in Chicago, and we've seen some of the heat waves and how it's affected folks. So people start to see the impacts there, and they can see the differences over time, and we can really help folks to see the connection to climate change. So in that way, yeah, definitely.
That's interesting. How do you prioritize? I mean, it seems like you're taking on so much. Now, sounds like you've got the biggest program, but I'm sure that there's more that you want to do than the resources that you have.
That's true. I mean, our program size is more than quadrupled, but the level of demands have risen exponentially. So even though we're the biggest program, we're the biggest that we've been, it feels the least manageable ever, like into a huge event, not just a little bit, like hugely unmanageable. It's just unbelievable. And so, yeah. So how do we?
But there are a lot of different places you could be. I mean, you could be spending all of your time in Washington. You could be spending all of your time in certain areas. You could spend your time just on coal-fired power. I mean, there's a huge range of things. So,
so we prioritize first and foremost of being about working with our frontline community. So our first allegiance is to working with our branches and chapters and our state leaders to help them to know how to sit at their decision-making tables and make a difference. So whether they're sitting in, on some advisory council at the municipal level, or sitting in the halls of the public service, or the rooms of the Public Service Commission, or wherever it is that there's decisions being made, how they can be there and be influential. So that's our first and foremost. No, it's simultaneously we're helping them to kind of be the change they want to see in the world. So in some ways, the Environmental Climate Justice Program is a little bit divergent from the other programs in that while we're working on, it's a civil rights advocacy organization, so for the large extent, we're supposed to be working on policy change. But we also see that we also need to start to model the ways that the policy should shift by actually starting to pave that path. So so instead of just working on clean energy policies, we help communities to develop solar gardens and community solar projects so that they are then stronger when they go and they advocate for the Public Service Commission. They can say, this is what this is to me, and this is how it's helped me. And so we're being very kind of concrete in that sense in terms of help people to start demonstration projects and pilot projects so that they can kind of be a living demonstration of what it looks like when we have the policies that we need.
what are some of the challenges that are faced in getting these pilots going?
So some places you need the policies before you can implement. So you can't really have an off-grid community solar project or an on-grid community solar project in some places because it's literally against the law. And so that's that's obviously a problem. We don't want to be leading people into jail. So
as a lawyer, I would advise against that.
So our legal department would frown on that as well. So that's probably one of our biggest problems is that a lot of the things, because the things that we want folks to do, the ways that we need things to go are transformational. So by definition, they're things that aren't necessarily legal now because we want to change the laws. And so and then so with that we have places where where we can do some of these things like California and so forth. Then people are like, oh, California, of course it's happening there. So it's not really, it's not really the best example. So we were able to get, a solar project going in Fairbanks, Alaska. That was something we could hold up. We were able to get a project going in Pittsburgh. That was something people were, felt like, okay, well, if it can happen there, I can maybe do this as well. So, yeah.
What do you think are the unique or important perspectives that communities of color or African Americans can bring to the climate issue or renewable energy issue in their local communities? What's distinctive and critical about that? Aside from the obvious fact that the voice should be at the table, but what's the value? What do you see as the value add there?
Part of it is pushing back on the dominant narrative, or some of the narratives around, because there's a lot of even energy companies will use this when they go into communities, like solar is only for rich people, or solar is only for white people, or these kind of things are for kind of hippie folks, and it's unattainable for like the regular person. So really making sure that frontline community folks, low-income folks, communities of color, that we really demonstrate that anyone can have access to this, and we can all do this together, and it can lead to economic justice for all. Is a key benefit.
I want to shift a little bit to the Trump administration. And actually, it's an action which the NAACP actually took recently, and not even Scott Pruitt is, last I checked, still the head of the US EPA, and someone at Environmental Defense Fund in a blog post recently said this, but I think it probably said generally, right? Scott Pruitt has made environmental injustice the norm at EPA. And the NAACP, along with various other nonprofits, have called for EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt to be removed for office. I imagine that's not something you've done much of in the past, although maybe I'm wrong, but it's looking like a no. So why did the NAACP decide to make such a request in this case?
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, just because it's just so stark that he doesn't have the interest of environmental protection, which is the name of the agency, at the heart of what he's done. The history. It's funny. This fellow Reverend Tyrone Edwards in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, was talking about some of these appointments, and he said it's akin to putting Dracula in charge of a blood bank. You know, so just talking about kind of the contradictions there, but. But with Pruitt, I mean, he had this history. I mean, he's sued the EPA 17 times. He's sued the Potawatomi, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations for water rights. I mean, the ones who were supposed to be suing us for water rights, and he sued them as the Oklahoma Attorney General against them for water rights. It denies that climate change is a human. It's a result of our actions, even though 97% of scientists have maintained that it is a result of our actions. So all of the things that are supposed to be, all his history just demonstrates that he's not in favor of the very things that we need to have a sustainable planet. So when we already had an EPA even before him, where they had their hands tied in a lot of ways from being able to make progressive policies that have the level of monitoring and enforcement that we need, that results in these, the very things that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation. To have someone who's actually making that rolling back further from that already insufficient protection is just untenable. I mean, yeah. So that was really why we just couldn't be silent in the face of that.
What's your view, kind of generally, on EPA? Do people at EPA? Well, let me start with that. So, how do people? How do you think of even putting Scott Pruitt aside for the moment, how effective is EPA at working on these issues?
I think, unfortunately, EPA has always been and continues to be, and even less so now. It's always been, more so now, it's been under-resourced, and therefore they haven't been able to fulfill their mandate. And so with all of these things happening under their watch, obviously they're not doing enough. I think that there's good folks in there that are very committed, and people who are maybe not just as frustrated, but frustrated and sympathetic to the plight of communities, but as I said, their hands are tied because of being under-resourced, because the laws aren't strict enough. We have Corexit being used for the BP oil spill, which is banned in 90 countries, but it doesn't even appear on our list of toxics, and therefore the Corexit soaked waste from the BP oil drilling disaster went into municipal, the landfills that were cited for household waste. So we have those kind of circumstances that are happening, and it's because they just don't have enough in the way of the laws and the way of the resources for monitoring and enforcement to do what they need to do. So EPA is just not effective enough because they don't have enough to be effective.
And a lot of this also takes place at the state level as well. And so do you see similar kinds of problems with the state environmental agencies?
I do, and then it's worse, of course, depending on the political situation in those states even. So there's under-resourcing in general, and then even more under-resources in states where folks are either overly influenced by polluters, or they or they just start. It's not a priority to protect these communities.
In light of that, I mean, do you all think of there are a number of different strategies, and maybe it varies based upon the circumstances, but educating people, organizing people, lawsuits. Certainly, the NAACP, or at least the legal defense, has history of the lawsuit. How do you think about which of these techniques is the first technique you would go to, or kind of what's more effective in light of these problems?
Right, and so it varies again, because even if so litigation can be a challenge when there is, for example, Title VI. You have to prove intent in some cases.
And can you just, not everyone may know what Title VI is.
Yeah, so the Civil Rights Act. So you have to prove, it can't just be that this community was disproportionately impacted by something. You actually have to prove that they were intentionally poisoned, and so just because they are poisoned, it's not enough in terms of litigation. And so not only those kind of the legal handles are insufficient, but also even when you might have amassed enough grounds, then you have these corrupt courts, and then you have the fact that we have Citizens United now, where corporations are seen as people, and so there's all of these challenges around the viability of litigation. So we have to be picky about when it is that we employ it. We definitely employ it. Sometimes it's just it's a symbolic, like we might do it just to raise, in and of itself, raise awareness, but not necessarily intending or thinking that we're going to win a suit. So it depends, I guess, is the point there, whether it's what our purpose is in doing it, and will we achieve that purpose in doing it. And so otherwise, with the other tools in our toolbox, education, organizing, using the media to gain. So sometimes we've been able to just kind of name and shame and have successes there.
Can you give me an example of where you've done that in the environmental justice work?
Yeah, the name and shame particularly.
Or any of these, I mean, where these strategies have been, you think, useful in achieving results for people?
Yeah, so I would name the work that, a number of the coal-fired power plants in Chicago, actually, with the Fisk and Crawford coal plant, the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, PERO, and then late to the game was the NAACP Southside Branch. Really, they used all these tools in their toolbox. They partnered with the Harvard School of Public Health to do a public health study on the impact of these two coal plants, the Fisk and Crawford plants, on the community. They did a big media campaign. They did a lot of organizing. They did direct action in front of City Hall, and they developed a local ordinance and then put it before City Council, and the local ordinance put certain standards. It opened the question of what kind of air quality do we want, and it put standards in terms of air quality, and then all that dialogue and organizing and conversations with even the plant owners and so forth resulted in the mayor giving an ultimatum to Midwest Generation, which control those two coal plants, to either clean them up or shut them down. And so Midwest Generation decided they didn't want to invest $1 billion to clean them up, and they shut them down. So.
In the climate space, there's certainly a lot of talk about cap and trade approaches to addressing greenhouse gas emissions. People talk about, we're at the University of Chicago, so we think about economic-oriented solutions. And people talk about greenhouse gas particularly because of the global nature of, at least it's presented as the global harms from those emissions, right? So the gases are going into the atmosphere, it's warming the atmosphere overall. So in some senses, people have thought, okay, well, this is a great example for cap and trade. But a number of the environmental justice organizations have been opposed to cap and trade. Can you say, in this context, can you say a little bit more why that's been the position of the organizations?
Sure. So there's a couple of reasons why people, a few reasons, I guess. One, the biggest reason is because the concern is that if you cap emissions of carbon in general, then it's going to result in increases in pollution in certain areas that are already experiencing a pollution burden. And so that's the dominant concern. And they've seen that play out, I think, evidently in some areas where they've employed this around the world. And so that's definitely the predominant concern.
I was going to say, so the idea would be if a coal-fired power plant reduces its emissions or shuts down, it's going to have to be replaced by a natural gas plant or something like that, which is cleaner in terms of its carbon emissions, but still emits CO2, and maybe it's located in a frontline community, and so that community experiences, and again, there's not much sulfur, but there's nitrous oxides and things like that.
Yeah, that, and even that if it just gets to be more expensive to emit carbon in general, then they'll continue to even run coal plants, but run them in places where it's cheaper for them to run them. And then maybe a plant that only is like a peaker plant that only runs when there's peak need will run all the time. And those peaker plants tend to be in those communities that they consider to be hotspots where there's already other pollution going on. So like both of those are concerns to folks.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
And a number of I'll say the big green groups, maybe that's a term of art here, have different views on this. When I say big green, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, most people, when they say it, they're talking about these, traditional big environmental organizations that have usually a conservation background. So I think, that's usually what I think of when I say big green.
So you think of big green. So a number of the big green organizations have come out in favor of policies like cap and trade and things like that. So obviously we see some disagreements here. Are there other areas of disagreements with big green organizations? And more generally, how do you see the relationship between those larger organizations, those organizations, I guess is a better way of putting it, and your program at the NAACP and frontline communities?
Yeah, I think that so whether it is being in favor of those kind of mechanisms that the communities don't believe in, and then not necessarily. So one of the challenges is since they are big organizations and they're influential organizations, they have a lot of money, then they're the ones who are making relationships with the federal government, and so they will be negotiating some of the very policies that end up causing harm to frontline communities, and they have the influence to do that, and some of them don't necessarily take leadership from frontline communities, where we think that frontline communities should be, as the ones who are most impacted by these environmental policies, they should be ones who are leading on the solutions. And so we've seen time and time again, even with the Clean Power Plan, the flaws in the Clean Power Plan as it relates to some of the market-based mechanisms, and not necessarily enough emphasis on energy efficiency in some of the other areas. It was the architects of it was one of the big green organizations that really got in and helped to design this program with federal officials. And so, yeah. And then,
so how do you address that? Do you say, hey, well, like, what about us? Like, we need a seat at the table. Here's a counter report. Do you educate, organize, litigate? I mean, how do you manage those relationships?
Yeah, so you've seen a whole range of things. Like sometimes people will do like an open letter there was an open letter at one point to one of the big green organizations. There was another open letter to a number of them because sometimes people are not even realizing, they're just like an elephant in a china shop. They don't even realize what they're doing or the impacts of what they're doing. So that's kind of best faith scenario. Sometimes it's really pointing out to federal officials or government officials that that there's another view, and as you said, organizing and building power and really presenting that alternate view. And sometimes it's putting together groups like there's a group that's coming together called the Building Equity and Alignment Group, which consists of the big greens. It consists of foundations that fund the big greens and grassroots groups all coming together and saying we need to be in alignment and we need to set a table where we come together around common principles and practices and hold each other accountable to it. And that's definitely the most promising practice, because we do want similar things. We just need to get folks on the same page.
In just a minute, I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. One or two more from me first. So some of your initial work related with the gender issues. How does that work affect what you do now, and maybe how do climate and energy issues impact women differently, or is a perspective, a gender perspective to that work, to these issues?
Yeah. So what actually led me to doing work on climate change was through the gender justice work that I was doing, particularly internationally, and finding that women were disproportionately negatively impacted by some of the by climate change in particular and other environmental injustices, and that women were least likely to be at the decision tables, whether at the helm of big green organizations or in government where decisions were being made. But yet studies were showing that when women are in leadership, the resources are handled differently. There's more sustainable ways of operating, whether it's at the household level or at the community level. So this is what we're finding internationally. And so I was interested in actually what was happening here in that regard as well, and found similar patterns. And so whether it's the earthquake in Gujarat or Hurricane Katrina, after disasters, the incidence of violence against women spiked significantly. So that was one of the first findings. That you see that in disaster after that, even after the BP oil drilling disaster, the domestic violence incidents in the police blotters quadrupled in some communities. And so that's one thing. Also, in terms of even on the other side of the climate continuum, in South Dakota and North Dakota, where they have these man camps where they do the oil drilling and so forth, you have this whole incident of, and they actually call it man camps. Anyway, they have this incidents of high levels of trafficking and drug trade and so forth, and these are often in indigenous lands. And so you have in these areas an extreme amount of missing and disappeared and murdered women, indigenous women, who are impacted by these areas and those practices and trades that go on there. And then also in overseas, where particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where women's responsibility in the household was to gather water for the household, women were having to walk further to get water. So and girls were having to miss school because they've had their duty was to go before school to get water and then bring it home, and then they go to school and they come back home and for the day. But because they're having to walk twice as far to get the water, they don't have time to go before school and get back in time. And so girls were now missing their entire education because of this household duty that has shifted because of drought caused by climate change. So there's multiple ways that women and girls are disproportionately impacted. And one of the intersections of this violence against women and this walking further to get water was in South Africa when I was doing a focus group on female-controlled condoms. They were saying that they wanted female-controlled condoms so that the girls could wear them when they would go to get water, because that was the level of incidence of sexual violence when they would go to get water was so high that they wanted to wear them every time they were going to get water. So that, it was the most chilling thing I've heard probably ever. And so so these are the kind of things that really led me into doing climate change work in the first place, through that lens and through that work around gender justice.
Wow. I guess my last question before kind of opening it up to the audience would be, what role can those people, myself included, who do not live in frontline communities, do that is supportive of your work in communities on these issues?
Yeah. So Definitely, and especially in these academic settings, we're seeing so many. We've been ourselves involved in so many relationships where professors or students, groups of students, have been instrumental in some of the work that we've done. A group of students, or one student actually, who was studying regulatory law, like utility law. Her professor said that his class had to do practical projects in order as part of their studies, and so he asked me for a list of topics that would be useful, and so I gave them to him, and one of them was looking at utility shutoff policies. And so she did a great job on this question that I asked, and out of that, we put out this report last year called "Lights Out in the Cold: Reforming Utility Shutoff Policies as if Human Rights Matter." And that report has changed utility policies because people have used it to organize and push for fair utility policy, which is huge. They actually got in Detroit, the Detroit Edison, to be able to the Public Service Commission actually forced them to have better energy efficiency assistance for low-income customers as a result of using that report, as a catalyst. And so, there's many examples of the same. Another group of students right now is working in Indiana University, Bloomington. This group of 20 students are doing their capstone project around low-income access to solar. So that's really exciting. Another group of students studied legal handles around gentrification and displacement that we're now being able to use to put together a toolkit on how to prevent displacement at the municipal level. And then the Harvard School of Public Health was instrumental, as I said before, in working with Chicago frontline groups around the coal plants, and they were able to find that when they teased out all the other environmental factors, they found that 40 deaths and 1,000 hospitalizations per year were attributed to the Fisk and Crawford plants, which was a piece of data that was critical in their education campaign and getting the public on board. So there's so many research questions and so many things that universities, students, and others can do to help communities in their campaigns and drive them towards success.
Well, I think, unfortunately, we've hit our time limit. I want to thank Jacqui for showing us and sharing with us about her work. And please join me in a big round of applause.
Okay. I would like to open up the floor. I have 5 pages of notes. I'm pretty stoked. And I would love it if you all would just take a few minutes and open your mics and share one idea or thought or something that that piqued your interest. And I'll be happy. Oh, looks like we got a chat here. Okay. I can go down the list, or you can just turn on your mics and talk. Let's try the second first. Go ahead.
I think what is really telling for me was the gender aspect of going from her working from starting as a gender rights activist and then transitioning it into the green industry.
Yeah. What do y'all think about that? Somebody else want to chime in to what Dave's talking about? Let's hear from somebody else. Angel, you're at the top of the list. What'd you think?
I thought it was interesting all that she had to say. Something that kind of resonates with me is the environmental things that have kind of caused a lot of places and communities with the like toxicity and contamination.
Yeah.
And it's really awful. I don't even remember. There's a movie lost, kind of with. I don't even remember what the movie was called, but it was really interesting, and it dealt with the lawsuit that's been going on for like almost 20 years.
Something like Brockovich. It's a woman's name.
I don't remember, but yeah, it just made me think of that.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Will, how about you? Do you have something to share with us that kind of popped out at you as something particularly interesting? Kadesha, how about you?
It was a lot of information.
Was there one thing about you that's being particularly interesting, or kind of?
No, nothing really popped out. It was just a lot to take in.
Okay. Tamala, how about you? Do you have something you'd like to share with the rest of the group?
I thought when the interviewer had asked her, it was something like, what did she think people of color or Black people would bring to something? And I
Uh-huh.
thought that was a dumb question. Thought that was a stupid question. She could barely answer it. He started tripping up over his own question because he knew it was a dumb question. But that stuck out to me because then I started to tune in. But yeah,
Okay.
that's it.
Cedric, got something for us?
Nah, I got here kind of late, so I was just trying to take in what I could, but I don't have
Okay.
anything to add, not anything worth adding.
Okay. How about you, Roman?
It was also a lots of information. The thing that really made me think though was how the EPA just changes because they're supposed to protect the environment, but depending on who is leading the EPA, like all of that just goes out the window, and that kind of just made me kind of think about a lot of stuff. But it makes sense. But that's pretty much all.
Yeah, my problem with the EPA is like, so I think at least recently the current head of the EPA came from a heavy pesticides background. Like he was the CEO of a pesticide manufacturing.
Yeah.
So you'd think there would be like, not compete. What's the word I'm looking for? Conflicts of interest between running a agency that supposed to rein in companies like that,
Yeah.
while the head of the EPA is the CEO of said company.
Yeah, and he's brought 18 lawsuits against people because they've been trying to basically make positive changes against polluters. And so it's like that. I liked what she had one quote from a guy named Tyron Edwards down in Louisiana. Said it's like putting Dracula in charge of a blood bank. It's just ludicrous. But we can say that about most any of the cabinet members that we currently have. So y'all, if you haven't signed up to vote, please make sure if you're of age that you are ready to vote, because it's gonna, like Michelle Obama said, it's really gonna make a difference. It's really, we really have to get some new leadership, and that's where it starts. Let's see, Hurtis, do you have anything you'd like to add to our conversation?
Yeah, something that I found interesting is how she was talking about the urban heat islands and how like they're in different communities.
Mm-hmm.
It's like just spoke out to me personally.
Yeah, it's cool how you start to see connections with what we've already been learning in our other classes, and how right on so much of this is. Quan, how about you? Do you have something you'd like to add? Okay, Jasmine, how about you?
Yeah. I still think it's crazy that there are people in this world that still don't believe that.
Mr.
Climate
Paul.
change is not
Hold on, I'm sorry. That global warming is a thing and that is real, and then it's the result of our actions. Like, I really think that's insane.
Yeah. How about you, Keith? Anything pop out at you? Hey, Quan, turn off your mic if you don't mind. Keith, you there?
Yeah, I'm here, but nothing particular, Mr. Paul. Just more interested in her overall story on how she dealt with things like going about in the field.
Okay, good. Well, I'd like to share one thing with you all that popped out at me. It's something she talked about kind of early on when he was asking about kind of the context of the national NAACP, and she said that we are meant to be the sum of our parts. That this is not so much a top-down kind of organization, although I guess to some degree it needs to be, but it's more of a bottom-up, us listening to the people in what she, so often refers to as the frontline communities, and that's really what they are about, is being in service to these frontline local communities. And the interviewer asked, so what are some of the key things that you do? And she talked specifically in regards to kind of connecting in with local communities, doing visioning sessions, and then out of those visioning sessions, doing what she called a SWOT analysis, looking at strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats, SWOT. And that is a very common strategic planning tool. And I would invite you all to just type in SWOT analysis, SWOT analysis, because it is so closely related to what we do as landscape architects in terms of identifying the strengths and weaknesses, the opportunities, the threats on a site or in a community, and then using that information to begin to kind of illuminate the threats and the weaknesses, but also to really build on the strengths and the opportunities within a community. And so my argument there would be, at whatever scale we're working at, whether it's at a regional scale or more of a local scale, like a county or even a city or a small town, really taking the pulse of a community and understanding what it's up against in terms of threats and weaknesses, so that you can overcome those things, and also really understanding how to take advantage of the strengths and opportunities to make a positive difference in a community. Okay, what I'd like to do is let's take it's 2:18. Let's take a 3-minute break. No, okay, a 5-minute break, and we will come back at 2:23. Oh, and there's Quan. What do you have to say here? Something that stood out to me is how corrupted the system is, as she explained, involving toxic emissions in the atmosphere that are allowed, and despite the EPA's laws and regulations. Politics rules the environmental agency and the major decisions in general. Well, I think to some degree you're absolutely right on, Quan. And You know, one of the ways that that can change is by us voting, but also by getting involved in local politics. I loved her example of going to City Hall in Chicago, and especially there at the end, where she said, you know, his final question was, well, so how can we support your work? And she went right away to colleges, right, and said, well, there are groups of students and professors who are doing some amazing things. Like, I love that example of doing a study to see how many folks had their utilities shut off, and who they were, like what their race was and what their income level was. And I haven't looked this up, but I think the name of the study that these students did was Lights Out in the Cold. And the fact that from that report came a fair utility policy change in at the local government level. I love that. And I also like the idea of having pilot projects like low income access to solar. To me, that seems like that'd be a great collaborative studio project, or even a capstone project on your senior year. I'm also interested, she mentioned the gentrification and displacement toolkit. That sounds like another really good tool to look at. Okay, so let's see, it is now 2:20. What I'd like to do is take a 5-minute break. Let's come back at 2:25, and then I will go over a little bit more information and the assignment for the week, and then we can call it a day, okay? So I'll see you back at 2:25.